You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to the show. The Patrick Coffin Show goes upstream from politics and mundane daily events to the question of culture and how to repair the DNA damage done to the country and to the West generally. Today we're going to talk about the Holy See, the Vatican, how the news agencies communicate with the Holy See and vice versa, and how the pontificate of Pope Francis provides a whole new set of rules, some written, some unwritten, as to how to interpret the statements and decisions of the Holy Father, and on how to make important distinctions that are often lost in the mix. Joining us on this edition of the show is journalist Edward Pentin. He's the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register. He's worked extensively on radio. His work has also appeared in Newsweek, the Catholic Herald, the Holy Land Review. Edward's also the author of The Rigging of a Vatican Synod, an investigation into alleged manipulation at the Extraordinary Synod on the family. He joins us now from London. Edward, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Patrick. I'm actually calling from Rome.
Oh, Rome. I thought you were in Merry England. Rome, excuse me. That would make your title make even more sense, Rome correspondent. Well, thanks for staying up late to be with us. I appreciate it. It's amazing that our connection works. I have this joke about being in Italy, which I love, but in Italy, everything almost works. But we're witnessing a miracle. What I like about your reporting, Edward, is that you don't come through the lens of politics or right or left or radical, traditionalist, conservative, liberal. Your reporting is very fact-based, and I know people who read you regularly say that. It's balanced and it's focused on the facts. So let's start with some facts, which is to say definitions. What is the Vatican? Is it just an assembly of buildings? Is it different from the Holy See? Is it that 111 acres, jettisoned near downtown Rome? What is the best definition for the Vatican?
Well, the Vatican really is, as you say, it's the sort of geographical entity. So it's the 111 acres in the middle of Rome. But it's the Holy See is distinct from that in that the Holy See is its sort of international personality. Mm-hmm. So it's the part of the Vatican, if you like, that signs treaties, sends out diplomatic staff around the world, and so forth. So there's these sort of dual aspects to the state of the Holy See and the Vatican. That's how one has to. It's a rather complex definition of the Holy See, the Vatican, but that is how it works.
You see, because it's in Italy, it's all complicated.
Exactly.
When a New York Times reporter stops a cardinal walking to his morning latte in the square at St. Peter's, it becomes a Vatican source says, or according to the Vatican. This trope is used all the time when in fact there is no official spokesman except for the one deputized by the Holy Father. I believe it's Greg Burke now. It's been Father Federico Lombardi, and before that Dr. Joaquin Navarro-Valls. But that really is the only official spokesman for church affairs. I mean, independent of the office of the papacy, of course, right? So yes. Not everyone with a Roman collar who gets a mic stuck in his face is qualified to speak on behalf of the Catholic Church.
Exactly, yeah. You can't just sort of say a Vatican official said that and expect that to be the official Vatican view. It has to come from an official source, usually the Vatican press office, if it's a reported piece. Mm-hmm. But of course, each Vatican cardinal carries their own weight. So if you have a Vatican cardinal in charge of, I don't know, interreligious dialogue, for example, he talks about Islam, that gives a certain weight and a certain Vatican label to it, if you like, even if it's not the authoritative Vatican position. Maybe
symbolic heft?
Yes, exactly.
That used to be said of L'Osservatore Romano, didn't it? It was sort of the official... The state of the Holy See kind of journalistic organ. If it appeared in L'Osservatore Romano, was probably reflecting the mind of at least top cardinals, if not the Holy Father himself. I don't know if is that still true?
Well, it used to be more so. I mean, it's always been called the semi-official Vatican newspaper, but it's become, because it's rather become quite trendy and said some rather controversial things.
Yeah.
It's not being tied so much to the Vatican as it used to be. It does still carry some weight in that sense. Yeah.
I want to talk about something that a lot of Catholics ask me, and that is some of the decisions made to reshuffle the dicasteries that have traditionally been one thing, and under the current Holy Father, there seems to be kind of a slicing and dicing and amalgamating and jettisoning. It's almost, it reminds me of the way airlines buy one another, or radio stations here in the U.S. I can't keep up with that either. But one figure that keeps coming up as a point of controversy is Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, the former bishop of, I love this, Terni Narni Amelia. See, only in Italy. They can't have one name. It's got to be 3 dioceses in one. The Pontifical Academy for Life, prefect of the Understand, the Pontifical Academy. I believe there's another title he has, Grand Chancellor of the Pontifical JP2 Institute for Studies of Marriage and the Family. Does he wear those 2 hats now?
Yes, he does. He does. He's actually, in his later years, he's become quite important now. I mean, he used to be, as you say, the Bishop of Terni. Now Pope Benedict brought him in to be president of the Pontifical Council for the Family. That's now been swallowed up by this new super dicastery for the laity and life. So he carries quite a lot of weight now, heading those 2 things. But obviously also drawn some controversy as well, as we know. Yeah.
Well, how about the, let's use the phrase they used, homoerotic art in the cathedral basilica where he used to sit as the bishop, featuring himself being embraced by a naked man along with 2 nets that Christ is, I guess, dragging up to heaven. A lot of strange sexual, the only way I can put it is it looks like an orgy inside a net. And there's Archbishop Paglia grinning, being embraced by a mostly bottomless man. It's very, very disturbing. But he's doubled down on all of this, correct? He thinks this is a tool for evangelization in some way.
He does, yeah. It's quite, he played it down, because I interviewed him last month, and he was very dismissive, or played it down quite a bit. But there's been various things. I mean, that's one thing, but there's been praising, for example, Marco Pannella, who was very he was like the Margaret Sanger of Italy. He praised him on his, I think it was an anniversary of his death or something. And there's been various things where he's caused a lot of concern. In the interview he gave us, he kind of obviously tried to excuse himself on all of these things, but not everyone was satisfied with his responses. And I think very many people will find that mural very disturbing. It was painted by someone who was actually used in Britain. He's an Argentinian artist living in Britain, and he was used by people campaigning for same-sex marriage because of his art.
Well, he's openly homosexual, I understand, the artist.
So that was, I mean, that seems to say a lot for what that was, what it's about.
And put gently, Archbishop Paglia's background is not known to be science-based or moral theology or ethics. The Institute for John Paul II Institute on Marriage and the Family, I believe there used to be something equivalent. I know a similar name in Washington. That used to be known as a think tank of heavy-duty Catholic thinkers who bring Catholic moral principles to bear on questions, for instance, of new reproductive technologies and the like. I don't know what the mission of this new super dicastery, as you put it, is. What's the mission that he's now overseeing?
Well, I mean, he's not part of the super dicastery anymore because he's now in charge of the Academy for Life and the John Paul II Institute. But
I see. Okay.
But those 2 carry a lot of weight, and as you say, they're very academic positions. He is not a bioethicist or anything like that, but he is. He does claim to have knowledge of life issues, but yet it's a rather confounding appointment. And but it was Benedict who brought him to Rome, and we're not quite sure why that was, because there was still a financial questions over his financial questions during his time in Terni. which he's been acquitted of. But even so, there was the black cloud hanging over him, and that even so, Benedict brought him to Rome. So it remains a mystery why that happened.
Maybe have been some method to that madness of bringing him closer, hence, better able to observe or supervise.
Possible.
I think go ahead.
The other part of that, of Palio, though, is interesting, is that he's very closely connected with the Sant'Egidio lay community, and I think he was one of the founders of it. At least he was there around the founding of it. Yeah,
it's not well known to American listeners. What is that community?
The lay community of Sant'Egidio is basically like a movement which was set up in the 60s or 70s to help the homeless, the elderly, people with disabilities, and refugees. And so it does everything which, of course, Pope Francis is very keen on, which is very good. But but he's been very closely connected to that, and I think that has given him many ins, if you like, to various things through his connections with Sant'Egidio.
There's an Anglican philosopher of sorts who's publicly pro-choice, in their phrase, who was appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life. When I first saw this, I thought it was an Eye of the Tiber parody site, or maybe The Onion. But that's another decision made that's completely confounding and obviously scandalous. Has there been a published rationale as to why? I actually forget the name of the thinker. Doesn't really matter. But the fact is that this is what's the name?
Nigel Bigger.
Okay. Yes, Nigel.
Yeah.
Very quintessential name, Nigel Bigger. So he's there, and he's obviously antithetical in his view on protecting innocent life and its defense. Do you know why he was appointed? To what end? What possible value is there? Well,
as somebody said, it beggars belief. But
very good. That was inevitable.
Yes, but what I think the rationale behind it is that the Pope wants Vatican to be open to the world, and that means bringing in people who are in the world, who have different views to the Church, to see if they have anything to offer and anything we can learn from them. And so that sort of interaction, that dialogue with these people is all part of that. But of course, as we know, that can be problematic, and people are very upset about this, because the pontifical academies, although they've had experts who aren't Catholic, who have different views on different ethical views, like the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences, for example, or Pontifical Academy for Sciences, these issues dealt with at the Pontifical Academy for Life are what are called non-negotiable values. So they're values that the Church will not change on. So they're not prudential matters. They are moral matters which won't change. And so there's a difference there. I think people feel that compared to the other academies, you can't have someone on there who really doesn't think in the way that the Vatican does. And
well, it makes sense. If you have a movement of abolitionists and you invite a slave owner to get his take on things, it's hard to understand why that would further the cause of abolitionism. Or if you have a council on financial reform and maturity, bringing on a doctrinaire communist would also likewise be hard to understand. So I'm trying to wrap my head. Of course, you mentioned the phrase non-negotiable. That's also kind of fallen out of favor in the minds of some bishops. They don't like this idea of a hierarchy of priorities. Yeah. There's definitely a trend among some American bishops to equalize poverty, immigration, healthcare, even so-called climate change, alongside abortion, fighting euthanasia.
Well, it's a seamless garment approach, isn't it? But it doesn't. It's one can see what they're getting at, and I think a lot of people sympathize with that. But these non-negotiable values are often ones which I think they all are, in fact, are considered intrinsically evil if you do them, and so they are particularly serious. So, and especially if they're brought into legislation and into government. So,
sure,
I think that is the concern here, and I think people feel it just weakens the witness of the Church on these very important issues.
Let's turn now to another 800-pound gorilla, or possibly orangutan, and that is the silence from the Holy Father in the public request for a dubia regarding Amoris Laetitia number 8 with the troubling footnotes in there. By the way, Edward, I was saying Amoris Laetitia into my phone, and my text recognition rendered it Amoris Laetitia. So I've just gone with it. It's my nickname for it, Amoris Laetitia. The four cardinals, Cardinal Raymond Burke, Brand Muller of Germany, Carlo Caffarra, the last one's, his name's escaped me.
Jacob Meissner. Yeah.
Yes, Jacob Meissner. Petitioned the Holy Father. It's all very canonical. They are simply requesting answers to several questions with respect to the norms for Catholics receiving Holy Communion who have received civil divorces and are now remarried. And it depends on which diocese the Catholics live in who are asking the question. If you're in Dallas or Miami or Chicago or, let's say, Newark, New Jersey, versus a diocese in Cameroon or in Russia, or it doesn't matter where, it depends on how that local ordinary interprets the data of the teaching there. Archbishop Chaput would say one thing, other bishops would have different opinions. That seems to be the reason for the dubia, right? Dubia, Latin for doubt. They want to have it answered. The Holy Father has not answered. I understand from your reporting that that's been pushed a little bit further into the center stage in calling for a meeting with the Holy Father to sort this out. In the very spirit that the Holy Father has, wanted to encourage, the idea of the Jesuit ideal of understanding both sides of the question. A lot of Catholics want this meeting to happen because we're in no man's land. What's the authoritative teaching of the Church? Under John Paul II, in the era of Familiaris Consortio, you could know instantly. How? Read the document. That unity seems to have been disrupted.
Yes, it does. The argument against the cardinals, which one should obviously take into account, is that the Pope is concerned about dealing with these cases on a case-by-case basis, and you can't sort of give a cookie-cutter solution to each of these, in his view, because each case is different, each case is more complex. He said in response to the cardinals that these cases aren't black and white. You have to go with the flow of life, and you can't just apply these things sort of willy-nilly, as though, I think for him he calls it casuistry, that you can't apply these directly to these cases. So that's the Pope's point, and that due to the complexity of the situation, you have to deal with these things differently. But the Cardinal's point of view is that, well, the teaching is absolute. You had in Familiaris Consortio, John Paul II's document on this, he was very clear that there is no, based on Christ's own teachings, based on the clarity of Christ's teachings, you can't have divorced and remarried people who are living in an objective state of adultery without an annulment, receiving Holy Communion because they're in mortal sin. And if they don't realize they're in mortal sin, then they need to be told it. And that's the first duty, many think, of a pastor, is that he has to instruct them what they're doing and if they're in mortal sin and so forth. So there's no real leeway there, and that the only way they can receive communion is if they live as brother and sister in continence. But that was what Familiaris Consortio said. But in Amoris Laetitia, it kind of leaves out, and in the footnote, the famous footnote 351 in the document, it says, well, in some cases, that may not be possible, and so they may be allowed to receive Holy Communion. So it doesn't wash with a lot of people. And for those bishops and bishops' conferences who've said that, it can open the door to Holy Communion for some, obviously for others, it simply doesn't. And this is why you've got this confusion and these disparate interpretations of a very important part of church teaching. And that's what the cardinals are so concerned about. It isn't primarily that there's the geographical problem, that you go into Germany and there's a rule there, and you go to France and there's a rule there. It's primarily the fact that they're worried that people are going up to Holy Communion who really shouldn't be going, and that it puts their souls in danger. And that's primarily their concern, that it's abusing the sacrament, it's a sacrilege. So that's what the cardinals are concerned about, and that's why they feel there's an urgency to put this right.
This is where the press gets it exactly wrong, Ed, it seems to me. Cardinal Burke and others like him who are very, very clear on what, say, Matthew chapter 19, the whole weight of Catholic sacred tradition on the indissolubility of marriage. Catholics who are concerned about fellow Catholics receiving Holy Communion while in mortal sin are not finger-pointing them. They're not judging them or shaming them. It's a very charitable thing to not want them to commit yet another mortal sin of sacrilege by receiving the body and blood of our Savior while in that state of objective sin. There's a sort of terrible discontinuity, and I don't know if St. Paul would have qualified for membership in a dicastery in light of his words in the 1 Corinthians chapter 11 about being guilty of the death of the Lord. That's not very pastoral.
Yeah. Well, I think in the old rite, at least, it says every Mass that you must be careful not to pour condemnation on your soul by going to receive Holy Communion in the wrong way, and I think that's been lost. And I think a lot of people feel that the lack of reverence for the Blessed Sacrament, the poor liturgies, the lack of belief in the real presence has led to this, and that's why this whole general desacralization of society, of the Church, is just a part of that. And they feel that there's not enough respect for the sacred nature and the reality of the real presence, which has led to this.
As you report on things, Ed, you've been at this job a long time in various settings in fora, as my self-important way of saying forum is plural, fora. Do you believe that the current decisions being made in Rome and the confusion in the air follows upon the famous prophecy, if you will, or at least statement in 1972 that Blessed Paul VI said that the smoke of Satan has entered into the temple of the Church? And do you believe further that these present confusions are an outgrowth or an echo of the documents of the Second Vatican Council? Or is it that the Council documents themselves, as unread and ignored as they are by 99% of Catholics, have been hijacked by some who have an agenda, the very same agenda, in fact, that was alive during the writing and the drafting of the documents, namely to push the Church as hard to the liberal left side as possible? Where do you stand there?
Well, I mean, I'm a reporter, Patrick, so I report. I can't really say one way or another. I mean, all I can do is give the facts, and then I try to let people make up their mind. But I think the facts are that, exactly as you say, I think the council was good in itself, but it was possibly hijacked. But I think there's pretty much good evidence to show it was. And so you've got these strange interpretations, the purposely ambiguous nature of the council, I think, has led a lot to what we have today. And you saw it again at the synods, how
that's right, yeah,
on purpose to make the language ambiguous, particularly on this exact case of divorced and remarried Catholics. They made it on purpose ambiguous. They left out it's what they left out, which was the problem. It wasn't so much what was in it, it was what they left out. And
yes.
I think it's the same in the council. And so you've had it open to wide interpretations, and that's led to the kind of lawlessness, I suppose, you've got in doctrine.
Well, there are examples after examples of it. One thing that Catholics sometimes of a certain stripe do is they look at a magisterial document as though it is like unto Holy Writ, that it's unchangeable and that it's immutable. I can think of a couple of examples where that is shown not to be the case. One of them is in the description in the Catechism of the Catholic Church with respect to capital punishment, which was amended in light of Evangelium Vitae. Also, the treatment of lying, the description there was in a subsequent edition amended. It was edited under the direction of John Paul II. I wonder if some of Pope Francis's magisterial documents might be subject to similar future amendments. I'm thinking of the extraordinary interview that you did with the Egyptian Melkite Jesuit, Father Henri Boulard, a starker contrast between his on-the-ground expertise of Islam and what's enshrined in Evangelii Gaudium. Is that the first apostolic exhortation?
Yeah.
Could some of that be edited or better reflected to better reflect what's really happening in the world?
Well, I mean, that could come. I mean, the next Pope Francis's successor could easily put those things right. Somebody told me that he could. His successor could put a lot of this right in a month, but others are concerned that it could take a generation to actually put some of what Francis has done back into what they would consider more orthodox direct. Yeah.
There's a great taboo against saying anything that would remotely resemble criticism of the Holy Father. As a practicing Catholic, I understand and I sympathize with that impulse. So just want to make it clear to my listeners and viewers, we are not, attacking the Holy Father or trying to undermine his leadership. I'm allergic to bishop and Catholic leader bashing. But it's very interesting when we look back at bad popes. God has blessed us with very few bad popes throughout history. We seem very comfortable to talk about their foibles. Some had illegitimate children and so on. Some were bad teachers. Could you say, Ed, still maintaining a respect for the office of the papacy and for the person of the Holy Father, that his formation, being a Jesuit from South America, leads him to a kind of center-left Jesuit mindset, and he brings that experience to the way he teaches. John Paul II had his own Polish under communism intellectual formation. He brought that to his papal lens, so to speak. Can we legitimately speak of an agenda or a kind of bias, if you will, without in any way attacking the Holy Father personally? Is that a balance possible?
Well, I think every pope can be criticized. I think that is not out of bounds. I think because we've had very good popes in the past, that it's been. I think a lot of people have been quite happy with what they've done. Pope Francis has been quite a bit more controversial in a lot of ways, and so people have been perhaps more critical of him. But I think that in some ways, I think critical of the things he says, perhaps the things he does, but of course not critical of him as a person, or critical of him, or judgmental of him. I think that's where a lot of Catholics feel, that we have to draw the line. As a journalist, though, I have to include the criticism as well as the good things, because I feel you're not giving the full picture to the reader.
Yes.
You're just giving the smiley face, everything's fine, kind of.
Pollyannish.
Because I think a lot of people realize that that's not the case in many ways, because they feel that, they're just not happy with a lot of things that are going on. And I think that has to be reflected to give an all-round picture.
You report, we decide.
Well, that's right. I do agree with that.
The Holy Father has also said some things about gender ideology that previous popes in my lifetime have never said. He's called it, demonically inspired, and behind that is the father of lies. For people who want to make him into some kind of pro-gay mascot, that's a major recipe for failure. He's not on that side whatsoever. He's repeated that he's a loyal son of the Church, and that gender ideology is at heart demonic, that this is a spirit of confusion that no children, for instance, should be subject to. So in many ways, he's stalwart on some of the non-negotiables, and strong and repeatedly so. Yes.
I mean, this is the great puzzle, really, with Pope Francis, is that he is very strong on some issues which you wouldn't expect him to be, perhaps. But he does uphold those things. He does talk about the devil. He does take almost like an old-fashioned view of certain issues. So there's that sort of interesting contrast with Francis.
Do you think there'll be more voices uniting and speaking up with the increased number of ISIS attacks? The gap between the application of Islam, as it's found in the Quran and the Hadith, versus the line that Islam is a religion of peace, and that these people are kind of freakish parodies of the true religion of peace. Those two things can no longer fit together well, as your interview with Father Boulad expresses very well. What was your impression of Father Boulad? Does he come across as a zealot or someone with a chip on his shoulder? Is he the picture of that balance?
I met him, and that interview was done by email. So
email, I see.
I'm not quite sure, but from what I understand, I think he's very knowledgeable, and he's obviously speaks from experience and from a place where they do know about these things. Mm-hmm. I think when you read his interview, though, I think one has to bear in mind that he's not talking about Muslims as such. He's talking about Islam.
Correct.
And individual Muslims can be very peace loving and good, and often they are. But I think what his problem is with Islam and with the teachings of the Quran and Muhammad, and that he feels that they're so clear that if you, and the way Islam is constructed, the way many Muslims will read that is to read it literally. And if you read it literally, then an Islamist terrorist is basically fulfilling what is taught in the Quran and Muhammad's teachings. And that was his main point. Yeah. And
that Muslims are often the worst victims of Muslim terrorism. This is not a Muslim versus Christian war. Yes.
And another point too, which I'm sure he would have perhaps got onto, but it's not just Islam either. It's a kind of, I've spoken to Father Samir, who's his cousin.
Yes, the other, also Jesuit, no?
Also a Jesuit, also very, very strong on this. And it's not just Islam either with terrorism, it's also the spiritual crisis that we face in the West. Often the Muslims will react, or it'll fuel their Islamist extremism. Is the secularist, hedonistic lifestyles of those lived in the West. And that clash is also what's driving this. So it's not just Islam, it's not just verses in the Quran, it is also the way we live in the West which is causing this, and the sort of immorality and just denial of God and of any sense of transcendence. That too is fueling it.
I've spoken with people like Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who's Deputy Assistant to President Trump, and Robert Spencer about homegrown Islamic terror. You have these middle and upper class educated Englishmen, often fatherless, full of anger. Perhaps they run afoul of the law and they find themselves in prison where they become radicalized. And then they go to the local mosque and they're told about the risque pornographic culture, the total libertinism of the West, and that I'm sure you've heard the phrase "nature abhors a vacuum." Well, supernature also abhors a vacuum, and Islam offers a short-cutted, non-Trinitarian. Forget Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's too complicated. One God, Allah, Muhammad's his messenger. A very uber simplified version of religion.
Exactly, and this is what, of course, Pope Benedict was talking about in Regensburg in 2006. I mean, that was the essence of his speech. It got drowned out because of what he said about Islam being violent. But of course, his main point was this clash between, basically, you've got a cold religion, which is the secularist, Protestantized culture, which has become very dependent on science and positivist thinking. And then you've got the sort of hot religion, you've got Islam on the other side. So you've got one which is all about reason and science. You've got Islam, which is all about faith without reason. And you've got these two coming together and clashing. And that I think, was the essence of his speech, in which, he kind of predicted this back in 2006, if not before.
Yes, to talk about the irrational connection between violence and the disconnect, rather, between reason. Once reason and religion are disconnected, then the violent spirit can come in, and they responded by holding violent riots around the world, kind of, I won't say elegantly, in a salient way, proving the Holy Father's main premise.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Yeah. So it's the spiritual crisis, I think, that we have here as much as it is to do with Islam. Yeah.
This may not be even an answerable question, Ed, but why do you think that there is a taboo against talking about a clash of civilizations? I've heard that idea of poo-pooed constantly. Well, no, it's as though the idea of the theocratic world that Islam represents and wants to expand, and the democratic, liberal democracy that's represented by the Judeo-Christian tradition, to me, they are civilizational level clashes. No one wants to have that conversation. Am I in my own little silo here, or do you notice that as well?
Yes. Well, I think it's also here in the Vatican. I don't think they really want to talk anything about the clash of civilizations because they don't want this to happen. And I think there's a feeling that if you talk about this, it might happen. And I think it points to the fact that you have
a little late.
A little late, yeah. But also, I think it's because the answer has to be Christ and going back to Christ and back to the true faith and the Catholic Church. And I think perhaps there's a wish to avoid that, avoid realizing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the only answer. That's my own personal view.
Sure.
That the only answer is in Christ, and only Christ can bring true peace. So, yeah.
Well, your lips to God's ears. Yeah, we're not just talking about worldviews. We're talking about a person. Maybe perhaps that's what distinguishes the one Holy Catholic Apostolic faith from all the others, is that we don't offer a doctrine or a program. We offer a person, Jesus Christ. Certainly true. The Holy Father received a letter from Father Boulad, and it was based on your correspondence with him, very frank and direct, a very courageous letter, I thought. And it did seem to amend the way the Holy Father addressed his crowd at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. He did say some things that caught my attention. So there it is. The Holy Father is open to saying things from different angles.
Yes, I mean that speech he gave at Al-Azhar was quite well received. I mean, I think he was pretty strong. In a way, it was quite masterful because he was diplomatic, but at the same time, he did get across some pretty strong points.
That's true.
And that, of course, came after Father Boulad had written to the Pope back in August last year. So possibly certain messages got through to him that you can't just be about political correctness. You've got to really speak the truth about Islam and also, try and disassociate the violent aspects from it as being not truly religious and not from God. And I think that's what he said in Al-Azhar. Yeah.
A lot of people are not following or paying attention to the reforms of the financial side in the Holy See. I know Cardinal George Pell has been involved in implementing what we might call Franciscan reforms. I noticed that you just blogged that Libero Miloni, the Auditor General, suddenly quit. Is anything known about that?
Well, it's a bit dubious because he's only been there 2 years. His office has only been up for 2 years. It's part of the whole reform package that Francis put in to reform the Vatican finances. And, only 3 months ago, he was saying how much he didn't regret the job and he was hoping to see it through to the end. And now suddenly he's resigned. There's various questions about why that could have happened. No one knows for sure, but it does seem a little suspicious and problematic. I think he was doing some good work in trying to root out some of the resistance and some of those who weren't keen on the reforms. So it's an ongoing saga, this, because there are certain people in the Vatican who just don't want any probing, any audits.
That's right. Yeah. The more people they can resign, the happier they are because they can forward the status quo.
Exactly. And they don't... Somebody said they're either up to no good or they were up to no good, and they don't want that being seen. And I think that's part of it. But
wouldn't the church just be so much better if we could remove the sinners? Just be so much. Of course, it would only have 2 members, but
yes, that's right.
The Holy Father has dropped several hints in the last year or two, and as recently as. Well, as you and I were speaking a few weeks ago, he alluded to World Youth Day in Panama, I believe is the next one. And he said, the Pope will be there. Whether or not I will be there is another question. He's just mentioned little kind of peripheral hints that maybe he'll go to the good Lord soon, or maybe he might consider abdicating as his predecessor did. Have you noticed that? It's kind of hit on my radar screen a couple times.
Yeah. No, he said it at least 2 or 3 times. He said, I've only got a short time left, and I have to get things done, and things could be up to my successor. But I think whether this is to try and placate those who are against him, who think, well, he's not going to be here very long, or whether he's actually saying it in order to buck up his reforms and get them in place before he does leave. We don't know, but he has said it a few times, and I think it's, it may be true. I think maybe it is only a short pontificate. Who knows? But he's in pretty good health, though. So
he is very hale and hearty. Nothing wrong with his lungs during aircraft trips. So everything's in working order. The idea of the Holy Father having a press corps is a rather modern invention, isn't it? Was there any example of this prior to the invention of radio, let's say around World War II? I mean, my only memory my first memory of a papal spokesman was Dr. Joaquin Navarro Valls under John Paul II. I don't remember, perhaps I was too young at the time, the idea of a press conference and a scrum of reporters, throwing questions out. That's not the Pope. It's sort of quasi-authoritative, but not really. Is that a child of television and radio?
I think it is. I mean, I think John Paul II started these in-flight interviews. They used to be going on the plane over to a country, and they weren't so long, and they were kind of more sort of routine. They've sort of morphed into this rather big press jamboree, which is quite, it's causing a fair bit of concern, because they're talking about a magisterium, an in-flight papal magisterium now, where you've got whatever the Pope says on flight is sort of another part of his magisterium, which is problematic because he said some very controversial things on those flights and things which a lot of people agree with. So, it's certainly a product, I think, of the television age and the internet age and social media and so forth. I know some people go on the flights to the Pope's visits simply because of that interview, because they want the story. And it's become, really quite a focal point for the Pope, and, a good way of finding out where he's going and what he's planning.
Right. Well, he's the Pope. He's the one the Holy Spirit has given us, and we pray. I pray for him. I mean, he's on every rosary, and so we pray for his good health, and that Catholics are led according to the light of the gospel, and that's always a challenge. There's so many more enemies inside and outside the church today than when, say, my parents were growing up, and we're still dealing with the topsy-turvy wake of a ecumenical council. People forget, Ed, as you know, that there's a big picture here, that after the Council of Trent, there were 2 generations of trying to incorporate that and so on. Same with all the controversies that swirled around the definition of infallibility and Vatican I. There's nothing really new under the Catholic sun, is there?
No, that's right. And all these things do take time, and then maybe we're going through sort of growing pains of the sort of post-conciliar age, and things will get better and better as we go on. Maybe that is what we're experiencing. It's still only 50 years since the council, so we're still quite young. Yeah. Well,
as a fellow young man, Ed, I appreciate your time. Thanks for staying up late in the Eternal City to join us, and thanks for all your good work. I want to throw people at your Twitter handle. It's at Edward Pentin, that's Pentin, and also link to your book on the hijacking of the Synod at patrickcoffin.media. Thanks so much, Ed. I love your work, and I appreciate your time.
Great. Good to be with you. Thanks, Patrick.
This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?